Meanwhile, drones are massively attacking Russia. Last night, drones struck another Wildberries warehouse. This time, it was in the city of Chekhov, on the outskirts of Moscow. Locals are posting footage of fires and smoke. A Wildberries warehouse in the Leningrad region was also hit. The massive attack on the region was confirmed in particular by the governor. And in Syzran and the city of Kstovo, after explosions, oil refineries are on fire. By the way, the Kstovo oil refinery is one of the key producers of gasoline and diesel fuel for the aggressor country's army. Ukraine will continue to put pressure on the Russians in order to force them to end the war. This was stated by the head of the president's office, Kirilo Budanov. According to him, the Kremlin still believes it can achieve its goals by military means. However, this is a mistaken belief. Here are his words.
Don't cling to all these arguments about 40 days, 100 days, 115 days. The main thing is the result. It's not so important how we enter this process. What matters much more is what we come out of it with. For the Russians, the war is essentially at a dead end. Yes, there are some combat operations with or without advances, but strategically they have long been cornered. Kirilo Budanov, head of the Office of the President of Ukraine.
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that this pressure needs to be systematic and sectoral, I would say. That is, as we've already seen strikes on oil refineries, these need to continue. We need to expand strikes on logistical infrastructure. First and foremost, right now, we're talking about Wildberries. Of course, we're also talking about transport infrastructure because Russia is a very large country and it depends very heavily on railway connections. And we're approaching winter. And it's important to understand that any factory operating in Russia, it depends on electricity. In this way, the Russians are essentially giving us a hint about what to do to strike at power generation and transmission facilities, which is exactly what we're doing now in Crimea, and we're doing it quite effectively. Therefore, we need to make the war unbearable for Russia. And for that, let's say we shouldn't be saving money. We have to increase the pressure on the Russian hinterland while also holding the front line. That's our strategy.
This hinterland that you just mentioned, and the fact that it's there, that oil refineries are being attacked. So when recalling last night's events, I was talking about the oil refinery near the city of Kstovo. But what's important here is the degree of damage and how it's measured, or is it just the distance?
You know, in this case, at this stage, it's about the degree of damage. After all, when we talk about destroying logistical infrastructure, which, by the way, includes oil refineries, the goal is to make it as difficult as possible for the enemy to restore them and to minimize the amount of production these plants can output. And today, it's not really about range indicators, but rather about systematically knocking out, if you will, in layers, the enemy's infrastructure. That is, we're talking about the destruction of oil refining facilities in the European part of the Russian Federation because, well, let's put it this way, the density of such facilities in the Asian part of the Russian Federation is relatively low. And then as our strike capabilities develop, we will certainly expand the geography as well. But as of today, in fact, given that Ukraine is waging a war against the Russian Federation, our main focus is precisely on the European part of the Russian Federation.
What do we know about restoration? How capable are they of restoring those oil refineries of theirs that were previously attacked by the Ukrainian military?
You know, it depends on the degree of damage and the intensity of the damage, because there are facilities that they restore quite quickly. This needs to be understood, it's true. And there are facilities where the damage requires months and months of repairs. Moreover, it should be understood as follows. The Russian Federation has put itself in a situation where it cannot continuously attract funds and resources from, let's say, European manufacturers because they are critically dependent, I mean the Russian Federation, specifically on equipment. And this equipment also plays a very important role, considering that it is very difficult to deliver, or it is necessary to use so-called roundabout routes, or to purchase it from China at all. From China, so time also plays a serious role for us. And that is precisely why we do not just strike oil refineries, but carry out targeted strikes with the aim of causing maximum damage and making the restoration of these facilities as difficult as possible.
The way the Russians try to counter Ukrainian drones and generally defend their facilities, here I think it's appropriate to talk both about oil refineries and about logistics centers. Are they even capable to any extent, let's put it this way, of defending what is most important to them? Because with air defense, and we can see this in these shots, well, there are obviously problems.
Well, you have to understand yes and no. Both yes and no. No, you shouldn't think that the Russian Federation doesn't have air defense. And that's exactly why the effectiveness of our drones is somewhere around 30%, 35 at most. In other words, they do work, but you have to understand the following. Russia, in principle, even theoretically, cannot provide a dense air defense system that would prevent any air targets from breaking through to their facilities. And that's exactly why we use this by using the mass deployment of our drones, which are impossible to shoot down. So even when we say that the effectiveness of our drones is 35 to 40%, it means that out of 10 drones, 4 actually reach their target. And you can understand what it means to strike a civilian target that has no level of physical protection, and to destroy that target. That is precisely why we achieve our goal. And again, the Russian Federation simply cannot provide cover for these targets. Well, it's actually very hard to imagine how you could cover a target that occupies, say, an area of 178,000 square meters. It's extremely difficult, which is why we carry out such strikes. A war against the Russian Federation's civilian infrastructure cannot fail to be effective, and our task is simply to make it more massive and more precise in terms of delivering strikes.
The consistency of these strikes at various points in Russia, does it allow us to form a certain, kind of map, at least an imaginary one, of which regions are better protected or which facilities in Russia are better protected and which can be pressured more strongly?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's important to understand that the Russian Federation sets priorities for itself regarding the protection of facilities, its oil refining complex, and logistical facilities. And that is why, by using this kind of scale, and most importantly, the duration over time, because we have been carrying out these strikes for several months, we are able to create, and in fact, such a map has already been created regarding the level of effectiveness of air defense systems. And here we are playing a slightly different game. We strike at those targets that are less protected, forcing the enemy to stretch their air defense systems, and then we strike at those very same targets. So, this is a kind of war of attrition. As they say, it's about who blinks first and who gives in first. That's why this war will continue, and everything depends on how much we can, again, scale up the volume of our strike capabilities.